Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. World Watchers emanates from KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It is broadcast number 688, February the 11th, 1985. Last week I was sharing information with you about Edgar Eugene Bradley, a suspect of the Kennedy assassination that Jim Garrison wanted to see in New York, and it's common knowledge that Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese, his legal advisor, protected him from going to New Orleans to be cross-examined by Jim Garrison regarding the Kennedy assassination. But the important thing is that Edgar Eugene Bradley, as the West Coast representative of Reverend Carl McIntyre, had a lot of information he could offer because of his relationship to Clay Shaw of the OSS of the Permindex operation in New Orleans, and he in turn close to David Ferry and Carlos Marcello and William Donovan and William Casey of the OSS, and Clay Shaw's relationship to Colonel William Gale, Reverend Gale, the founder of the Identity Movement, the plan to kill all Jews in America, all blacks in America. And Gale was a tutor and protege and worked with Colonel Charles Willoughby. I guess he went on to be a general later, Charles Willoughby, the chief of intelligence, and they also got guerrilla warfare training with General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. Then Gale came home and became political activist with the Religious Front, part of the movement that's now attempting to turn the entire world Christian. And he is his beliefs, the Identity Movement, is part of the Klan, the Nazis, and the Minutemen who went under and became the survivalists. So that their arrangement for cleansing this country of communists or non-believers, it goes back to the Philippines, it goes to MacArthur and to Willoughby and to Bradley here in California, and meetings with Clay Shaw here in California. Now those connections are terribly important. I started my research 21 years ago because I wanted to find out who killed John Kennedy. And I not only wanted to find the smoking gun, but I wanted to know who covered it up. And who covered it up is continuing today, and it's up to you listeners at some point to challenge the writers, the people, the publishers of newsletters coming out now with their position and why they hold that position that they have. There's a JFK newsletter called The Third Generation by Jerry Rose. I don't know Jerry Rose, and he's never taken one broadcast of mine in the 14 years. And somebody wrote to him about his newsletter, and he wrote back that he wouldn't work with Mae Brussell because she criticized Sylvia Marr, who put down Jim Garrison's investigation and arrest of Clay Shaw. She also left out the Young Americans for Freedom, the Munich, Germany connections to General Walker, very important part that is not separate from, but is consistent with Clay Shaw and the people he worked with nationally and internationally. Now, the CIA has a budget of $22 billion, and there's Navy Intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agency, various branches, Air Force Intelligence. I can't accuse these people with these new newsletters or the books coming out of being part of the intelligence establishment. I can't prove they are, but there's absolutely no proof that they aren't. It's like Ben Bradley at Washington Post hiding the real story of Bob Woodward and concealing the true story behind Watergate. A lot of CIA people are publishers and newscasters on the radio, and these private newsletters can be means of getting your name and address to see how much interest there still is in the assassination. There's one thing that makes my research different than any other researcher, with the exception of Paris Limon, who wrote the book The Kennedy Conspiracy. One part of the research we share in common, and I probably learned this part from him and then from the Torbett document, and that was the part about Permindex and the operations of the OSS and Clay Shaw with the Nazis, Hallmar Schacht and Otto Skorzeny, and he brings in the Borghese family and the Italian German fascist network into the book The Kennedy Conspiracy, which is very valuable. The other work I've done literally on my own, which is the Young Americans for Freedom, the William Buckley, E. Howard Hunt connections to Munich, Germany, to General Walker, who in turn worked and crusaded with Billy Hargis, and they worked with Charles Willoughby, the protege of General Douglas MacArthur. And Willoughby was the chief of intelligence of Douglas MacArthur in the whole Asian the theater of our army. He was the advisor coming from Europe, and Mr. Wiedenbach, going by the name of Willoughby. And out of that, the protege there was Colonel Gale, Colonel William Gale, that I mentioned last week, with the Identity Movement, the religious organization that touches, in common with the Posse Comitatus, the American Nazis, the Minutemen that became the Survivalists, and the Ku Klux Klan, and the various groups that want to cleanse this nation of Jews and blacks, all of them nesting in the Philippines there, and also working with the John Birch Society and the Young Americans for Freedom. The Torbett document and the YAF set me apart from the other researchers that have published. There are some people such as John Judge in Washington and David Emery and Nip Tuck doing radio work in the Bay Area, and Tom Davis supplying books for the researchers, and Charles Spears in Texas. These particular people are on to the overview. They understand the complexity of the assassination cabal and touch on these various areas in letters or in radio work or in short material. John hasn't published officially, but he does have a newsletter and a very good resume of the assassination cabal. But the area of the YAF in Munich, the Torbett document, the Reinhard Gehlen connections to the Nazi overthrow of this country, literally the coup d'etat of the Nazi agents working with the American agents and taking over our various universities, schools, hospitals, and the Pentagon. And then the fourth area that I have been alone in exposing, that the others refuse to pick up or go with, is the Robert Byron Watson affidavits on the successor to Mr. Robert Welch of the John Birch Society, Larry McDonald, and Murder Incorporated, coming out of DeKalb County with its national, international combine. Now, when these people want you to get a newsletter or a book, challenge them. Write letters to them, such as this one person did. Don't let one person do it for you. Dissect their excuses, scrutinize the techniques that they cover up. They're not ignorant. I've been on the air 14 years. They can have any single tape or combination of tapes or sources of information. They want to stay over in that motorcade and listen for an extra shot or see that face in the shadow that maybe is a gunman or a piece of a gun instead of the branch off of a tree. When you hear from them, keep challenging them, as I say, and don't accept the low-level story of the Kennedy assassination. It's a waste of time. Get on to the bigger stories because they're in the news all of the time. Now, there was one big story on the Kennedy assassination this week that made 2-inch space in the LA Times and U.S. News Today that should have made the headlines, of course. It has to do with the trial down in Miami, Florida, and the Liberty Lobby, the newspaper, had been sued by E. Howard Hunt because they published the fact that E. Howard Hunt had a role in the Kennedy assassination and was in Dallas. Now, I have one article on this case just before it was concluded. This is from the Miami Herald this past month. Libel trial resurrects the Kennedy conspiracy theory. This is the Miami Herald, written by Stephen Doib, D-O-I-B. And the article goes this way. Mark Lane will ask a Miami federal jury Monday to decide if E. Howard Hunt, and he believed he was, the Watergate and CIA defendant, and he also was the paymaster for the Bay of Pigs, was personally involved in the assassination of President Kennedy 21 years ago. Now, remember that if E. Howard Hunt was involved, and the lawsuit was won by Liberty Lobby, and they proved in court that E. Howard Hunt was involved. No headlines, but where does that make Oswald? We'll do more on that in a moment. But if Hunt was involved, a legal, by definition, a conspiracy is two or more people doing an illegal act. So it wasn't just E. Howard Hunt and Oswald. If Hunt was involved, then more people were involved. The article goes on that Liberty Lobby was sued in 1980 by E. Howard Hunt. The case was filed in Washington, D.C. The newspaper that they published, called Spotlight, had an article by Victor Marchetti, a former CIA agent, and he said there was a 1966 memo that purportedly said that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed and suggested that he had a role in the Kennedy murder. This was in 1978 that this came out. And Hunt spent 33 months in prison as a Watergate defendant and charges of burglary. In the earlier trial, according to the Miami Herald, in 1981, Hunt was allowed to present witnesses to prove at the trial that he was in Washington, November 22nd, 1963. But the defense wasn't allowed to produce the memo of the allegations of his role that came from the CIA. There were arguments that the memo that Victor Marchetti produced were simply to get CIA to threaten E. Howard Hunt and make him a scapegoat for the Kennedy assassination, which would be difficult. As I say, he couldn't act alone. Now, the jury had awarded E. Howard Hunt $650,000. Liberty Lobby appealed, and a retrial was ordered. But this time, this far right-wing organization and violently anti-Semitic brings in supposed to be a Jew, Mark Lane, and he represents them. And the Miami Herald said this time they hired the attorney Mark Lane, the author of Rush to Judgment. Now, it's interesting that Mark Lane comes into this case to prove for Liberty Lobby that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas, because Mark Lane has never wanted to get off the grassy knoll. In fact, he was angry when I wrote my Watergate story that E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis linked to the Kennedy assassination. That made him furious, and he went on the air and said I was mentally sick. So now, if he could make a buck saying that Hunt was involved, I guess he would get involved, and he did. The article goes on that Lane lambasted the Warren Commission. He also lambasted other researchers who did a little more than he did, and he didn't want them to do anything. Mark Lane, according to the Miami Herald, in the early 1970s, defended James Earl Ray. Now, that's the alleged assassin of Martin Luther King. It's interesting that they bring out that he represented James Earl Ray, because there isn't much difference between Liberty Lobby and James Earl Ray, even though the years have passed. Jerry Ray, the attorney, and the brother of James Earl Ray, is the attorney for J.B. Stoner, that with direct links to the Hayden Lake Nazis, the Aryan nations, and Stoner's role with Mr. Matthews and the Klan and the Nazis in the South is horrendous. And Mark Lane was defending James Earl Ray. And also, at the time, that Larry Flynt was paying Mark Lane to get out that copy of the LA Free Press. 1 month later, Larry Flynt goes down to Atlanta, Georgia, Marietta, Georgia, in that area, and is shot by people working with and part of the Stoner operation right down there in Georgia. After the Free Press is out, 1 month, Lane's, the client, James Earl Ray's brother, works with Stoner, and Stoner played a role in the shooting of Larry Flynt. A complicated circle and a little hard to understand unless you've known these people for a few years, and then it becomes a little more understandable. Now back to the Miami Herald. Lane in 1978 was hired by Jim Jones, and after the Guyana tragedy, he accused the government agencies of conspiring to help them commit mass suicide along with their followers. Now, Lane also said that he was within inches of where the deaths were taking place, and he heard gunshots inside of their lot. He and Charles Gary were sitting outside and heard these people being shot. It's a hard way for all of them, a mass suicide and bullet holes and so forth, and then to be covered up by blankets when these people didn't have the rifles, and the ones with the rifles got away and are still at large, over 120 of them, I forget the exact amount, who buried the bodies on top of each other until they decayed and rotted, and then could be picked up without identification. Now, the article goes on. Lane's defense for Liberty Lobby is to prove the truth of the Victor Marchetti story, that the document not only existed, but that he had a star witness who he was to produce, Merida Lorenz, Lorenz. You may remember her name. At the time the House Select Committee on Assassinations was working, her name surfaced. She was formerly a friend of Fidel Castro. She was given poison to kill Castro as part of our CIA plot, And according to Mark Lane, Miss Lawrence said that she went from Miami to Dallas the day before Kennedy's death. There was a 2-car caravan with Lee Harvey Oswald and several anti-Castro Cubans, including Frank Sturgis, who was later part of the Watergate burglary. And in Dallas, Lawrence supposedly met Hunt that day. Now, it's interesting that they have Lee Harvey Oswald in this caravan from Miami, and Mark Lane's going to win the case. So which of the Oswalds was in Dallas just the day before if this one was in a 2-car caravan with Frank Sturgis? That's why the material on the Oswald doubles is so important, and I always really wanted that to be the first book I wrote on the Kennedy assassination, on the Dallas doubles. Well, this was prior to the case being heard by the judge, and then this week there was the article that, yes, in fact, the E. Howard Hunt story was proven to be true by Liberty Lobby. The LA Times has a short story, no headlines, February the 7th, page 22. USA Today has it on 2A. The LA Times story says Hunt loses his libel suit over the article on the Kennedy death. A federal court jury denied Watergate burglar E. Howard Hunt Jr. $1 million in damages and said he had not been libeled in the article by an ex-CIA agent saying that he was part of a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. And it goes on that this trial's been going on for a long time. The 6-member jury found in favor of Liberty Lobby, a right-wing Washington tabloid that publishes Spotlight. It appeared in 1978. Hunt displayed very little emotion at the verdict. The USA Today says E. Howard Hunt lost his claim for $1 million damages against a conservative tabloid that linked him to the assassination of President Kennedy. So, and there's a picture of him, and it says, tabloid linked to JFK assassination. E. Howard Hunt was pouting. Now, if he had a role in the Kennedy assassination, and you have to re-examine again the whole story of E. Howard Hunt, which always should have been done, because he was very close to William Buckley, who founded Young Americans for Freedom, which was a cover group or a branch for the John Birch Society. It was part of the John Birch Society to take over the campus crusades and the young people throughout the country and move them in the direction of the right. And this relationship between Buckley, who founded Young Americans for Freedom, with Charles Willoughby and Ronald Reagan and Raymond Donovan, our Secretary of Labor, our certain one right now, and Robert Morris, and these various people. This is an important, as I say, one of the elements that's been left out, an important part. And of course, I wrote about it when, at the time of the Watergate burglary, when they were arrested. Being the first person to make the connections of E. Howard Hunt to the Kennedy assassination happened when I wrote my story, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, and went into Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorini, same person. So Hunt, is his relationship with Buckley, they were in the CIA together in Mexico. William Buckley, the founder of the YAF, that brought the men from Munich, Germany, with General Walker to Robert Morris's home as part of the YAF operation, has been the godfather of E. Howard Hunt's children. As I say, they worked the CIA together. They've worked in intelligence at all levels and in media work, writing, both of them writing. Close personal relationship. So E. Howard Hunt lost the suit, which again opens up Douglas Caddy and Young Americans for Freedom and the Munich group. That's the next logical place to go forward for those who never went there, and go back for those who have a chance to reread some of the material I've written or to play the tapes that I have had on the air. Now, layers of the cover-up, I just want to mention a couple of them now, will continue, as I say, as long as we allow it. And I will be writing a short article for Bob Banner. He publishes that small journal called Critique, a journal of conspiracies and metaphysics. And just this last month, he sent me an issue of it. And there's a story about Edward J. Epstein, written by Marion Kester, Kester, who evidently contributes regularly to Critique. And this is the way her article begins. It's about questioning who is Edward J. Epstein. the fellow who does cover up assassinations and also works for the intelligence community. This is a quotation. "Now everyone will know who I am," end quote. Lee Harvey Oswald, under interrogation in Dallas, November 23rd, 1963. Then, 20 years later, Ron Rosenbaum interviewed on ABC, the anniversary of Kennedy's death. "The most interesting question is, who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Everyone will know who I am." Then Marianne Kester chooses to solve the complex Kennedy assassination. She then writes, "That does remain the big question. Not that it hasn't been answered. It took a while, admittedly, but it has been." Anthony Summers, another person who writes little pieces but covers up a lot, sums it up. "The pawn of the renegade intelligence operatives and their Cuban mafia contacts." Well, when Oswald said, "Now everyone will know who I am," he didn't mean Cubans. He didn't mean anti-Castro Cubans. Oswald didn't work with the mafia. He didn't work with the anti-Castro Cubans except in New Orleans with Guy Bannister, who was also in the Minutemen and in the Bird Society and an FBI agent. Guy Bannister had a lot of roles, and they were federal agencies, you see. When he worked at Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans, it was funded with the Free Cuba Committee out of Mullen Associates, which was the Howard Hughes organization in Washington, D.C. Hughes is Defense Department and satellites and missiles as much as it is hiring Giancana and John Rosselli. Oswald worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with the oil people and the oil geologists. He worked with the Nazi connections in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and with Michael Payne attended the meeting of General Walker when he was there a few weeks before the assassination. He worked with people from the Defense Department, such as Max Clark from General Dynamics, Chief of Security, or lived with Michael in Michael Payne's home, who worked for Walter Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal, and the members of the Saccone Oil Group and oil engineers. And his benefactor, George de Mohrenschildt from Brown and Root, worked with the CIA and was a suspect Nazi. So that when Oswald said, "Everyone will know who I am," what he meant was, the question was asked to him, did you get into the car of Michael Payne and Ruth Payne, a white station wagon, in front of the Texas School Book Depository? You ran in front of the depository and got in the car, and the Warren Report writes up later that he left the back of the building and got in a cab in a bus and then to the rooming house. And when he was asked by Sheriff Craig, who saw him and recognized him on the evening news getting into the station wagon, he asked him in Captain Fritz's office, as I say, did you get into that car? And he said, "Yes, but leave the Paynes out of it because everyone will know who I am." Now, the Paynes aren't mafia. The Paynes aren't Cuban. They're third generation Harvard physicists with links to the intelligence apparatus. And if you go to my article, The Rebel, that I will be referring to over and over again because it is so pertinent and it is good, and these new cover-ups come up, just like last month's article on "They'll Know Who I Am," and saying, well, Summers finished it, it's mafia and CIA. On page 31 of that Rebel article that I wrote, a few connections in Dallas of General Walter Dornberger and Michael and Ruth Payne. And it goes into the people where Marina lived, and Lee went on weekends and stayed, and they brought Marina to him, to his door in New Orleans. And the Paynes supplied the story that a rifle was in the garage. They supplied a box that allegedly held a negative of Lee holding a rifle, even though no one was there to inventory the box. They supplied a letter, Mrs. Payne, to Marina Oswald, which became Exhibit 1, Volume 16, that allegedly was instructions after he was supposed to have shot General Walker. That's undated, unsigned, one of their wonderful fabrications. And Michael Payne worked at Bell Aircraft in the Defense Department and took, as I wrote in 1963 of November, on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, he took Lee Oswald to see General Edwin Walker before the assassinations. And then I went on to say Michael Payne was a descendant of the Cabots on both sides. Henry Cabot Lodge was Richard Nixon's vice president running against John Kennedy. at the time that Kennedy won the election. His cousin Thomas Dudley Cabot, former president of the United Fruit, offered their Gibraltar Steamship Company as a cover for the CIA during the Bay of Pigs. That involves E. Howard Hunt, the paymaster, and Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorina, and our various Watergate defendants were with the Payne, members of the Payne family at the Bay of Pigs, and George de Mohrenschildt was down there walking around there in Nicaragua on the property prior to the invasion. Another cousin of theirs was Alexander Cochrane Forbes, a director of United Fruit and a trustee of Cabot, and Forbes. Both Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy were part of the United Fruit team. They were members of the Warren Commission. They were affiliated with and directors of the United Fruit team. And Ruth Hyde Payne kept close ties with the Forbes family. Peter Dale Scott, the investigator, went into the Paynes, the patrician Payne and Forbes family, he called them. And Michael Payne was third generation Harvard physicist, and also General Dornberger worked with Albert Speer. There's a new book out about Speer and his real links to the Nazis and how they tried to make him look so respectable when he came to this country. And then I went into Mr. War Criminal, Mr. Dornberger, where Payne worked at Bell Aerospace. So that the layers of cover-up, and I'm going slowly now because the major pieces are put together, and I'm going to be doing a lot of broadcasts on who has covered it up and what they've covered up, as I've tried to do, but it's time to name names and challenge these people to how many levels they're going to cover. When Mark Lane comes to the point that E. Howard Hunt is in fact involved with the Kennedy assassination, where does Mark Lane go then? How much can he tell, or does he just drop it, take the money from Liberty Lobby? And why do people like Marion Kester, writing for Bob Banner, try to say that Anthony Summers has solved the problem of who now they know who I am? That is a quotation that Lee Harvey Oswald said, directly recorded into the police department, and with the exception of Mae Brussell, nobody has asked to relate that question to his answer he gave about that Michael and Ruth Payne's car, and asking, well, who are the Paynes? Who is Oswald? If you know he has the Payne's car, then you know who I am. A crucial question. Now, Lane can be angry for my writing the Watergate story. He was furious at the time. I was doing Kennedy research for 9 years, and then I met him later and talked to him, and I was writing about Bernard Barker and his relationship to and Frank Sturgis and the men arrested at the Watergate Hotel. But now he's got E. Howard Hunt, their paymaster, as part of the conspiracy. As I say, where does he go now? And interestingly enough, going back to The Realist that I wrote in 1972, now we're 13 years back, I wrote that Frank Sturgis was a close friend of Diaz Lanz, Lanz, the Cuban exile community involved in right-wing movements such as the John Birch Society and the Billy James Hargis Christian Crusade. Now, the John Birch Society, with Frank Sturgis and Lanz, and the Christian Crusade involves General Walker and the Munich people who come to Dallas-Fort Worth, Sturgis and Hunt, and these characters play one role in the Kennedy assassination. It's divvied up into 5 pieces of a pie, but they all connect, and one of the connecting links, as I said last week, is this Clay Shaw in California with Reverend Gale and with Edgar Eugene Bradley. So when in 1972 I was writing about the relationship of Billy James Hargis and the John Birch Society, and of course they all connect to the paramilitary right that is moving with the real Christian Crusades today and influencing our Joint Chief of Staff and many people in Washington. When I was writing the Watergate story, I described the offices of Robert Bennett, the son of Senator Bennett from Utah, and Robert Bennett was the president of Mullen public relations firm, and the active head of the head of the consultants there was Douglas Caddy, co-author of the Young Americans for Freedom with William Buckley, and the desks there of E. Howard Hunt at Mullen Associates were a continuation of the Howard Hughes organization, and I wrote that Robert Mullen, supposedly the CIA, was a co-founder of Young Americans for Freedom, and members of the YAF supported Agnew for President of the United States, not Nixon, but Agnew, and it was in the office of the Mullen Associates that money went to Riley Coffee Company, where Lee Harvey Oswald worked. So you get your Birch Society and your YAF with the German connection coming in, and a continuity from 1963 to 1972, and then right up to the present time, where their names again now are in the news. And in the Realist, I did write about the Young Americans for Freedom and Robert Morris, how they came to Dallas in 1962 with a plan to take over the country. All of that is in my story, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to some more material on the Kennedy assassination and the cover-up, because of all the new books and material coming out at the present time. This is Mae Brussell. It's World Watchers International. The program is called World Watchers. It's tape number 688, broadcast number, and of course it's taped off the air February the 11th, 1985. Now, why have these various people been avoiding the Torbett document, the nomenclature of assassination cabal? Bill Turner, the investigator, was in New Orleans. I saw him there, was at the home of Jim Garrison. He spent a lot of time with Jim Garrison. Mark Lane was there. All of this material that Garrison had, they have sat on. As I say, Bill Turner has hit on many pieces of this puzzle, done as much good work as a person could do without synthesizing it and calling names and putting himself, up there, up front, making those vital connections. He refuses to do that, but what he does offer, just like Peter Dale Scott, is valuable information individually. But they also get very angry at me for making these connections, and that is something I don't understand. Bill Turner was trying to exclude parts of my article for Rebel and cut it down. He was here at the house working with me. Larry Flint wanted him here. Many of you know it. And I would give him the research and put it on the desk, and because we were in such a hurry to get it out, and what he typed out was he left out 1/3. I'd come back. I'd call Larry. Finally, I had to ask him to leave because he was deleting very vital pieces that are necessary for you to understand, and that Larry Flint wanted in the article that we kept in. But I had to fight and fight. It wasn't a question of space to get this material to you. So I hope you read it carefully and realize some of the problems Larry Flint came across as soon as he stood by me and wanted to publish exactly what I had to say. Now, making the connection of Clay Shaw to Reverend Gale and Edgar Eugene Bradley and Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan, I want to read a few pages of the Torbett document, and maybe each week, if it's apropos of something in the news, I'll do more. I just want to give you a sample of it because many of you don't know this, but it is available, and I've given you the address and last week of where to send for it. In this item, I'm just going to jump to a few pages. One on page 14, the purpose of Permindex, the organization we were talking about, was to build, acquire, and operate hotels and gambling casinos in the Caribbean, in Italy, and at the other tourist areas. Now, the sources for this, one is from Basel, Switzerland publication, A to Z, August 1951, Canadian Le Devoir publication, March 67, Rome, the Paes de Serra publication, March and April 67. There's a lot of sources. People say, well, the Torbett document doesn't have its references. There's 5 references right here on page 14 for that statement alone. Now, it goes on. The principal financiers of Permindex were a number of U.S. oil companies. And the reason I'm reading this to you now and slowly is that these people are the major people that meet with and go on to the Minutemen, the Klan, the Nazis, the John Birch connection links, the secret society of the John Birch. People worry about the P2, the Masonic Lodge. It's no different than the John Birch Society and these other organizations of the Posse Comitatus and so forth. The principal financiers of Permindex in America were the oil engineers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. H.L. Hunt of Dallas, Texas. Clint Murchison of Dallas. John DeMenil, D-E-M-E-N-I-L, the Solidarist director of Houston. That is for the white Russian, the Tsarists, and Nazis that came over. John Conley as the executor of the Sid Richardson estate, which then this branches out later to the Great Southwest and the Eastern Network of the World Commerce Corporation Group. and Sid Richardson State, the Halliburton Oil Company. Senator Robert Kerr of Oklahoma. Out of Oklahoma came Dr. Jolly West, and I learned something by listening to Nip Tuck and David Emery's program. Some listener called in and said that Dr. Jolly West in Oklahoma was working on LSD experiments, the first ones in this country, before he went to UCLA to become head of that Neuropsychiatric Institute to study terrorism that Ronald Reagan set up with Edwin Meese. But in between, he went to Texas to represent Jack Ruby, who had that 1-minute epilepsy. Other people named here are Troy Post of Dallas, Lloyd Cobb of New Orleans, Dr. Oshner of New Orleans. I've done programs on him with Hale Boggs and Ed Butler, and Lee Harvey Oswald, going to Patrick Frawley and the Birch Society, and Phyllis Schlafly and the China Lobby, linked out in California, and Oshner on the board of Technicolor with Patrick Frawley. George and Herman Brown of Brown and Root of Houston, Texas. That was the cover for George de Morenschelt, Lee and Marina's mentors. And attorney Roy Cohn, chairman of the board of Lionel Corporation of New York City and Schenley Industries. That's Lou Rosenstiel out of New York City. Walter Dornberger, the ex-Nazi general, and his company, the Bell Aerospace, Pan American World Airways. Paul Rygotorodsky in Dallas, and he set up the network for George Bowie and George de Morenschelt and Lee and Marina Oswald's infiltration into the military and the Defense Department in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Claiborne Oil of New Orleans, Credit Suisse of Canada, Heineken's Brewery of Canada, and a host of munition makers and NASA contractors. That's page 14. Another page of the Torba document says the former Nazi rocket officer, Mr. Walter Dornberger of Bell Aerospace, was directly in charge of the assignment to Michael Payne of Bell Helicopter Corporation, a subsidiary in Fort Worth, Texas. Payne's assignment was to provide a place for Marina Oswald during the approximate 8 months prior to November 22, 1963. And that introduction was made by George de Morenschelt of Brown and Root and CIA with the Nazi connections. He had went to a dinner party and introduced them, then he could fade out. They took over. He provided the Paynes for Marina to live with his wife, Ruth, in Irving, Texas, and Ray Kristanik testified to the Warren Commission. He worked at Bell Helicopter, Krystinik, testified that Michael Payne, immediately after Oswald was captured at the theater, said, "That stupid blank, 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 he wasn't even supposed to have a gun." Werner von Braun of NASA first met Clay Shaw of the OSS and World Commerce Corporation that builds up the German munition cartels. He met him in 1945 when he and Walter Dornberger and 150 other Nazi rocket scientists abandoned the Peenemünde, the simulation of which was photographed by the OSS and Ronald Reagan that we talked about, and he traveled to join the American forces in Germany close to the French border. The Nazis were brought to the Deputy Chief of Staff's headquarters, where Major Clay Shaw was an aide-de-camp to General Charles O. Thrasher, Deputy Chief of the European Theater of Operations. Von Braun, Dornberger, and Shaw maintained their relationship through the years through their mutual connection with an organization set up to protect the defense industry from spies working there. It was called Defense Industrial Security Command. Now, a lot of people, so-called researchers, will say, I don't believe the Torba document because I don't know DISC. This was simply a way of screening people because they were going to make atomic bombs at Los Alamos and work on missiles and rockets after the war. It was a way to screen the employees so that nobody except the inner team got there. It was for employment purposes. Another page of the Torba document, page 76. In the transfer of Nazi rocket scientists, the service of Adolf Hitler's intelligence agency was used extensively, and Clay Shaw in New Orleans and Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and many others had a close association with the Nazi agency and its commander. They were better known as the Federal Intelligence Agency, the FIA, the Bundesnach, I can't pronounce the German word, it's Bund, B-U-N-D-E, SNACHRICHTENDIENST, known as the Federal Intelligence Agency of Germany. It was largely dependent on the Central Intelligence Agency, they subsidized it and controlled it until the BND was formed and Gehlen went back to Europe to have his own intelligence operation. The director in 1963 was Reinhard Gehlen of the FIA and the BND, the ex-Nazi colonel who was recuperated in August 45 by Allen Dulles of the Warren Commission. Allen Dulles in the OSS in Switzerland in charge of American intelligence activities, and we've talked about that before. It goes on to say that in Poland, Reinhard Gehlen's guerrillas, March the 28th, 1947, murdered General Karol Swidzinski, Vice Minister of Defense in Poland, under the name of Walter he used, who commanded the 14th International Brigade in Spain against Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. He was the model for one of the characters in Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Carol, like Carol Wojtyla, Karol, and his name is Swierczeniski. And these are the people described in the Torba document. Also says that Mr. Gehlen had a network of people called under the Economic Association for the Development of South Germany, and he had members of the Gestapo such as Boemel, Boemel-Burg, head of intelligence in Berlin and France, Alfred Siex, SIX, and I've mentioned him many times, former SS journal and one of Adolf Eichmann's subordinates who was put in charge of Gehlen's contacts in Western Europe. Siex also came down to North Carolina to form the Special Forces at Fort Bragg, and also there are allegations that they had a role in rehearsing and getting ready for the assassination of John Kennedy. That is part of the Torba document. Wouldn't you think that some of the researchers, besides Paris Flamon, would have asked in these over 250 or whatever books on the Kennedy assassination what is going on? This, just in conclusion, one more page. It says, after 2 years of intense and extensive investigation, Jim Garrison made a well-recorded public statement showing beyond doubt that he traced the Nazi rocket scientists, the World Trade Center, where Clay Shaw was in New Orleans, and Permindex, with the fascist solidarists, those are the Borgheses and Otto Skorzeny and Hallmar Schacht, to the American Council of Christian Churches, which is Reverend Carl McIntyre and Edgar Eugene Bradley, that Reagan and Meese wouldn't extradite, the Free Cuba Committee, which is linked up to Mullen Associates and Douglas Caddy and William Buckley and E. Howard Hunt with the Young Americans for Freedom, and the Gambling Syndicate, which is Sam Giancana and John Rosselli and Santos Traficana and Carlos Marcello. He linked them under the syndicate and the mafia and NASA Security Division into its umbrella controlling organization titled the Defense Industrial Security Command, headquarters in Columbus, Ohio, and Redstone, Alabama. He traced these 5 groups with links to the FBI Division 5, William Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, supervised by the Joint Chief of Staff in the Pentagon. Now, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency became Daniel Graham, who is a partner with Fritz Kramer, the mysterious Fritz Kramer, the mentor of Haig, who worked with Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines and in South Korea, with Kissinger and Haig, and then it goes on to Kissinger Associates, and beginning to put in the fascist dictatorships all over the world. This was part of Kissinger's job. You see what Zia is doing in Pakistan and Pinochet in Chile and other places around the world. Now, those are just 3 pages from a 250-page document that has been available since January 1950, and when I went to the assassination conference in Boston in 1975, there still wasn't one person using any of this material at that conference except Mae Brussell. No excuses for these people. Why haven't they gone into this? Because there are many pieces of information that fit right together on this story. Also from Chapter 2 of the Torba document, it says Clay Shaw, the defendant in the New Orleans assassination case, and L.M. Bloomfield of Montreal, Canada, were the only North American members of both the board of directors of Permindex and Centro Mondial Comercial. There were 2 groups out of the World Commerce Corporation. One was titled Permindex, and the other was the Centro Mondial Comercial. Now, I may have had these on the air at other times, but the reason I'm repeating it, as I say, is that they're new listeners, and also because Clay Shaw, with Colonel William Gale, who now in 1985 is teaching how to cut the throats and smother and assassinate and cut off heads and slice up Jews and blacks in this country today. You have to go back and re-examine Clay Shaw with Edgar Eugene Bradley and Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese, because this is an academic. This is your future Attorney General. It is your current President of the United States. It is your current network by computers listing the name and address of every Jew in America and how to sit on their doorsteps and know everything about their children and family. This is current, and that's why I'm bringing back the Torba document, because I will continue to tie it to Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese. And as I say, you can make copies of these tapes and send them to various senators if you want, or the sheets that accompany these broadcasts, because Edwin Meese will be voted in as Attorney General. Now, Clay Shaw and Bloomfield were both OSS and CIA. Bloomfield was an American citizen and a Canadian citizen. This goes back to the British Canadian American Corporation, they all working together before it became the World Commerce Corporation. Shaw was one of those put into the Swiss corporation called Permindex, living in New Orleans. The other members of the board of this is Commercial Centro Mondial Comercial, or Permindex. The other members of the board include the publisher of a fascist national Zeitung in West Germany, an Italian industrialist married into the family of Adolf Hitler's finance minister, and a Rome lawyer, the secretary of the fascist party, among Clay Shaw's friends. Also on the board of Permindex was Ferenc Nagy, the Solidarist, the prime minister of Hungary from 1945 to 46, who used the alias George Mandel or Mantello, a Hungarian fascist who supervised the attempts to purchase national monuments for real estate development in Italy. And of course, he was in Dallas, Texas, when John Kennedy was assassinated. Now, not only was that in the Torba document, but again, the Kennedy conspiracy by Paris Flamand refers to the links of Clay Shaw to these various organizations. But there's one error Mr. Flamand makes, which is, we'll allow him that because his intentions, I'm sure, are very good. He's talking about the CMC, that Corporation Centro Mondial Comercial. Clay Shaw, the OSS, this is Wild Bill Donovan. He says it was founded, this particular branch that branches off the World Commerce Corporation, that itself was founded in 1961, as soon as Kennedy was elected President of the United States as against Richard Nixon. And he mentions various people on the board, including Max Hagman, owner and editor of the newspaper National, spelt with a Z, Zeitung, not to be confused with the neo-Nazi German National- und Soldatenzeitung. There's two newspapers in Germany that have a similar name, and what he's trying to say that the newspaper involved with the person who owned it on the board of the organization that Clay Shaw was a member of was not the fascist organization. But if you read my article in The Rebel on page 34, where I talk about General Walker, he was in fact in touch with the Nazi newspaper, the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung. I'll spell these out for you, and if you don't have this information, send a self-addressed stamped envelope. You don't have to try and write these names down, and you won't remember them. But what I wrote in 1983, that General Walker worked with what has been identified by Paris Flamand as the Nazi group, the Adolf Hitler group. General Walker did, in fact, work with that group, and then he brought those men, Young Americans for Freedom, he was stationed in Germany, into the Dallas-Fort Worth area to the home of Robert Morris, who was in charge of counterintelligence and psychological warfare during the war. And I wrote in 1983, the Munich newspaper that General Walker called was linked to the World Movement, called the World Movement, for a second anti-Comintern. It's part of Galen and the U.S. right, and members of the board are from the SS, Hitler's Gestapo, are on the staff of a newspaper. As soon as John Kennedy was killed, General Walker picked up the telephone and called this newspaper. I'm going to send a copy of this page of The Rebel, to Nip Tuck and David Emery in the Bay Area, because I was listening to some broadcasts of theirs, some tapes, and a listener called in and asked Nip Tuck the role of General Walker in the Kennedy assassination. because in the book Dallas Conspiracy or Beyond is a book that Peter Dale Scott and several people got out. They mentioned General Walker, but the real General Walker was picking up the phone the day after the assassination and calling this newspaper and say, the man that killed Kennedy is the same communist that tried to kill me. He doesn't say, I met Lee Harvey Oswald at a meeting prior to the assassination with Michael Paine, and he didn't say there's no physical evidence at all linking him to a bullet that went through Walker's window. But the point is that General Walker was linked to the world movement, and part of the Galen, he was linked directly to members of the SS. The editor of the newspaper he called was Gerald Frey, F-R-E-Y, a close friend with Nazi members of the Witiko League, W-I-T-I-K-O League, L-E-A-G-U-E, the Witiko League, and the Sudanese Landsmen's Craft, and I'll write those out for you, were organizations for relief people to come to this country to begin stirring up the Cold War and to get World War III going. By the from 1948, they formed large organizations. This is what I wrote in 1983. And by 1958, Dr. Walter Becker, B-E-C-H-E-R, was elected to the executive board, and he was one of the kingpins of the Nazi Front organizations. Senator Joe McCarthy and Charles Willoughby and General Edwin Walker and Robert Morris, with links to German Nazis, converged when Dr. Walter Becker set up his offices in Washington, D.C. in 1953. The war is over and the Nazis are settling here, the same Walker who's to call the paper run by Ribbentrop and the Gestapo and tell the world that this communist in the Dallas-Fort Worth area shot at John Kennedy. By 1957, I wrote, Becker praised American Opinion. This is the John Birch publication and other extreme right publications, and started his policy of liberation of people in Eastern Europe. He worked with General Douglas MacArthur and Senator Joe McCarthy and General Charles Willoughby and members of the U.S. Congress to meet with public officials and to cooperate with the Nazi resurgence. Now, these are sections of material that I have written through the years. The Watergate story, this is the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. I wrote that Dan Smoot, the former Dallas FBI agent, is the type of person who kept strong Nazi ties from Dr. Becker in Munich, Germany, to the Western Goals Organization in Los Angeles that has the computer to every police state in the major city, I suppose, in this country. The LAPD was piped into it, and it only was exposed because of a lawsuit and Jay Paul. But they also affiliate through John Reese and the organization itself to other agencies. It can't just be the LAPD. And I wrote that Volkmar Schmidt from the Young Americans for Freedom came from Munich, Germany, to work full-time for General Walker. And I asked the question, how long did he work there, and where is he today? And brought up in that article on the Kennedy assassination in 1983 the interconnecting links of people that bring in Clay Shaw, and this is important. They bring in Clay Shaw, who works with Reverend Gale and Edgar Eugene Bradley and Carl McIntyre and William Donovan, and they bring in the Young Americans for Freedom and the Munich connections of Walker to Robert Morris. Many of these separate pieces, I put together at different times, but I want to reiterate them when material comes out about the Kennedy assassination. And with this story about E. Howard Hunt losing $1 million because he was involved with the Kennedy assassination, you get right to Buckley, Young Americans for Freedom, and the CIA, and the interconnecting links of the John Birch Society and the teams that were behind the Kennedy assassination. Now, a listener to these broadcasts who sends me a lot of material that I'm very grateful for, sent me an article, an editorial written by John Kennedy for Look magazine, January the 16th, 1962. You can go to the library and copy it. Now, by January 16th, 62, General Walker and Larry Schmidt and Volkmar Schmidt were already setting up their teams to come to Dallas-Fort Worth area to Robert Morris and the Birch Society, H.L. Hunt and Mr. Murchison. Kennedy was already dead, but he was writing what would happen in the next 25 years. Soon in June 62, Larry Schmidt would arrive from Munich, Germany. But John Kennedy doesn't know that. And they asked him, the 25th anniversary of Look magazine started in 1937, they asked him to say, what do you think will happen 20 years from now. And John Kennedy made a few statements on this one page that are worth noting. As I say, contrast this now to Ronald Reagan, who worked with Charles Willoughby and with Reverend Gale and Mr. Rousselet of the Birch Society and the Christian Crusade Group, all of the right-wing paramilitary group protecting Edgar Eugene Bradley and his links to Reverend Gale. Even to this day, they're not calling them terrorists. This compare what John Kennedy wanted and what we've got right now with Ronald Reagan in office. He was projecting 25 years, so when Reagan leaves office, it will be exactly what John Kennedy wanted, because it's been 21 years since Kennedy's death. He said he has no special insight into conditions in 25 years, and America has no 25-year plan to regiment its own economy, much less the world. But he said it has no special power to impose its will on the other 94% of mankind. 25 years from now, America will be imposing its will on 94% of mankind, even if 100 million have to die to do it. He said some facts remain. There will be risks and burdens and hardships and challenges and constant threats to freedom. Opportunities for chaos and crisis won't lessen. There will be change and progress and opportunity, he says, ways political, economic, social, scientific, and medical to keep working. He said on the 50th anniversary of Look magazine that folded when it made connections to Mayor Joseph Alioto and Fratriano of the Mafia, they were forced to close house. He said, I hope we will have made peace more nearly secure. Do you think the Star Wars offensive weapon against Russia that Reagan's doing is going to make you secure? He said, tranquility, I hope, will have replaced terror in the intercourse of nations, and we're sending billions of weapons for terror, arming people, and then coming in with other arms, arming both sides. He said, I hope the lives of people will be richer and more secure, and that their anxiety of unemployment and illness will be greatly reduced. Can you imagine that? Hospital bills are $1,000 a day. Unemployment of the minorities is up to 40%, and we're building factories overseas and closing up our domestic places for tax reasons and cheaper labor. He thought the anxiety of unemployment would be over and illness would be over, and that our national output will have vastly increased. We're borrowing billions of dollars from overseas. We can't keep up with our money game. I hope the next quarter of our century will make progress in protecting the natural charm of America. He didn't see Mr. James Watts coming along the line, or Mr. Hodel, did he? He said, I hope in the next 25 years we see a great enlargement of the democratic spirit, and we will have achieved a degree of national maturity and respect for human dignity. He didn't see them quartering them alive, gouging the eyes out, burning them, peeling the skin back, the Contras. He didn't see that, did he? John Kennedy couldn't have seen that. Agent Orange and all the chemical, biological increase of weapons that we're doing. He said, I hope that not a single voice will be heard to begrudge the care of the sick, the schooling of the young, and the conservation of our resources or help for the jobless. He should see the penny arcades, the subways, the streets of our major cities, the food lines. His goal was that these people had education. When Ronald Reagan came in as governor, he wanted to cut off the education, University of California. Now he wants to cut off funding for people middle class, educating their children and putting tax benefits into the religious schools, turning them to Christian preschool, school, and colleges. Care of the sick is out. Housing is out. Who can afford a house, $100,000 or more? You're absolutely dependent upon the landlord, the energy, your oil and gas, your heating, your telephone. By the time you play the monopoly game and give them all the resources, you have nothing but interest left and debts to go to the bank. He said 25 years from now, let us hope all Americans will realize this kind of expenditure in your health and dignity and schooling and conservation, helping the jobless, wasn't an investment. It's an investment, he says, not a waste, and it's a source of moral strength, not weakness. I am somber as I look ahead, not merely because of the perils and pitfalls that await us, because of all the work that remains to be done. That was just a few months before the assassination team began to arrive in Dallas with their links, as I say, to Ronald Reagan and Charles Willoughby and General Walker and Robert Morris, the chief counsel for the internal investigation, the Senate committees of Senator Joe McCarthy, with his links to NASA, to Nazis and Vatican, and the interconnecting webs of conspirators. It's a pretty sad story, the dream of a person as against the reality, and to realize simultaneously, as you overlay it, that his death was being planned while his goals could never be attainable. This isn't what this group wanted. And next week I will continue some more about the Young Americans for Freedom and the men that came from Germany, the kind of world they want, which is the Clint Eastwood, the Mr. Getz, the shootout at the subway is what they want. Not employment for these youth, not homes for the youth, not education, not doctors if they're sick or psychiatrists if they're sick. They want guns to shoot them up, sweatshirts to advertise it, and get tough with the have-nots, pollute the earth. Kennedy's dreams were gone. He stated them very clearly on one page, and 4 months later, the team was getting set up to murder him. They practiced a lot earlier, but one part of the team was set up. Well, the time is running out now. I'll continue more along this line because the Kennedy matter is pertinent to Reagan and Meese and the people in power today. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.